Hello. Hello, both of you, Molly and Liz. It's so great to be here with you. My name is Mike Arauz, one of the founding partners at August. And I'm really excited to be here with you today, really excited to talk to both of you today. For those of you watching this, listening, who don't already know, Molly and Liz are the authors of a wonderful new book called Big Feelings. And also previous authors of another book called No Hard Feelings. Big Feelings just came out this week, end of April 2022. And it's a fantastic book. We'll talk a lot more in just a few minutes about what's in the book and some of the things that we took from it. But I do want to say, for the record, and to both of you, it's a really, really fantastic book. Congratulations on it. It's beautifully written. It's very honest and very open and very personal. And I think it's also about, big feelings, and we'll talk more about what those are in a minute. But we don't, as a society in the world, we don't talk about big feelings enough. And I think that this book is a great kind of inspiration and reason to have more conversations and to start some new conversations about big feelings. So to get us started, let's just do a quick check-in round. And the check-in question is just what's got your attention? For me, this is it. I'm here. I've been looking forward to this conversation and just eager to hear from both of you about everything that you've learned in this book. Molly, let's go over to you, and then we'll go to Liz next.
Thank you. And thank you, Mike, for having us. We're excited to be here. Big fans of August and all the work that you do. What has my attention is our book came out yesterday, and there was a lot of time and effort put into it. And now I am feeling a little bit like after you do a bunch of exams and you lose that adrenaline, and I'm just trying to be kind to myself and my body and take it easy.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Maybe I'll be more specific and say sleep. Just trying to catch up on sleep. And again, just make sure that we rest after, I would say, a busy, even couple past months leading up to the launch. Yeah.
Well, you deserve it. And again, thanks for carving out the time to have this conversation. So yeah, let's get into the book. And my first question for you is just, why did you write this book? And maybe Liz, you could start us off, and then I'd love to hear from you as well, Molly. Yeah, why this book? Why did you choose to write it? Why this topic?
Yeah, so our first book, No Hard Feelings, all about emotions at work, came out in February of 2019. And that year, kind of in the months following that book, Molly and I both went through really difficult times in our personal lives, and I'll let Molly speak to hers. My father-in-law was losing his 10-year battle with cancer. I was commuting 3 hours a day at the time. There was a lot going on. And I was like exercising, I was journaling, I had a therapist, I was doing all of the self-help things, and nothing was working. And so that was the genesis of what about these more challenging feelings where it's not just an affirmation or a phrase that moves you through it? How do you just keep putting one foot in front of the other? We actually pitched that book to Penguin in January 2020, so pre-pandemic. And they were very kind, but they essentially said, it's a kind of depressing book. What's the audience for this? Does anyone really want to talk about this? Do people really have these big feelings? And so we went back to the drawing board. Pandemic hits in March. And in June, Penguin came back and said, that book about like really hard stuff, we think we're ready to publish that. So it was also interesting to watch the sort of the publishing world. I guess, yeah, I'll use the phrase catch up to the emotions that Molly and I were feeling. And then Molly and I have also talked a lot about, with the pandemic, I don't want to say it's ending, but sort of shifting to maybe endemic state. we had a conversation once of like, will this book still be relevant if there's not a global pandemic that's fresh in everyone's mind? And the answer we found is yes. Like, if you live long enough, you have really hard times. That's kind of what you're signing up for.
Yeah.
I think, it's funny because we wrote the book No Hard Feelings, and then we were like, actually, there are some really hard feelings. I think that when I was going through a really difficult period that I write about in the book in the fall of 2019, I was so eager to read books about other people going through hard times and making it through them okay, and like what had been helpful to them. I think so many of the self-help books that are out there are like, okay, here's the 10-step plan to get through this. And that, really isn't reality a lot of times. And so, and there are some books that I found really helpful, but I just like wanted more. And so I was curious, and I was like, I wonder if we could write a book where we talk to people about how they had been through hard times. And we had built up a newsletter following, an audience, since our first book had come out. And so that's really where we started, was like reaching out to people in our network and in our audience to talk to them about, what big feelings have you been through? What was it like to work through them? What was helpful to you, to get sort of a collective approach?
Yeah. I mean, the timing certainly has been fascinating, and one of the reasons why the book resonated for me so much, I think, is because there is, I think one of the things I've noticed over the past 2 years, and how kind of the past 2 years have shaped how I think about big feelings like this, is the realization that it's about the challenge. The work is about figuring out how to navigate these feelings, as opposed to like escape them or end the big feelings or avoid the big feelings. It's about getting through it, and that certainly feels every ounce as relevant today as it was 2 years ago or longer. And I'm curious, what, as you've been having these conversations, especially over this past week, but especially in the past couple months, as you've leading up to the release of the book, what are you noticing out in the world? What seems to be resonating? What are you seeing that feels like it resonates with the book, and feels connected to what you've written? And Molly, maybe you can start us off then.
Yeah, so it's interesting because there's a bunch of other books that have come out around this time that are also dealing with difficult emotions. So Susan Cain, whose work we love, she wrote the book Quiet. She just came out with the book Bittersweet, which is about sorrow and longing. And she had also started writing it before the pandemic. Dan Pink's new book on regret, Brene Brown's new book. So it is very interesting. I think there must have been something in the air for all of us before the pandemic, but then definitely the pandemic happening, I feel like, made it more socially acceptable to talk about these things. I think we have heard from people in a different way this time than when our first book came out. So when our first book came out, it's all about emotions at work. And people were sort of like, okay, tell me how to deal with this thing that I have going on at work, or like, let me talk to you about my boss. And it was like these very specific questions. And it was in this moment where people felt like, yeah, I am having emotions at work. And like, yeah, maybe I would like to bring them a little bit more into the workplace. And then, the pandemic happened, and like everyone, it's like we shattered that divide between work and home. And so I think that that's no longer as big of a question. Like people are like, yeah, I'm bringing my emotions to work. But, and I know we'll talk about this later, but like, are you really bringing your like biggest feelings to work? Like anger, sadness, grief, like, are we still really bringing that to work? So I think we're hearing some of that of like, we just wrote an article for Harvard Business Review about anger at work. And it's like the most popular article. Liz and I were just texting about it. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of angry people, or people who want to talk about their anger at work, which So that, and then on the personal side, I think, people throughout the process of writing this book, when you said, we're writing about envy and regret and these things that we label as bad, people do really open up, and they're sort of like, even if they don't get into the specifics, they're like, oh, that's like very topical for me right now.
Right. And what are you seeing, Liz?
Yeah, very similar. It's interesting too. I think a lot of what people will talk with us about is still burnout, perfectionism. So even with the book, I think what's visible in the world to us, it's still not like despair, regret, sort of the really harder emotions that are still hard for people to talk about. And we hope that will change. I think one of the reasons we open up quite vulnerably about our own experiences is to help normalize it, and to make people feel less alone, have less stigma around those harder emotions. So it's interesting, even in, I don't want to say, I think actually in the private conversations we've had about the book, some of the really hard feelings come up more. But then when we're doing promotion, I think people still like to veer the conversation towards slightly more like socially acceptable things, like, oh, I'm feeling very tired at work. I feel overwhelmed because of the pandemic. So it's been also interesting to observe the topics that people still tend to, again, like move towards in a public forum.
Yeah. Let's jump into that a little bit, and talk a little bit about big feelings at work, because so your first book focused specifically on feelings in the workplace, and so you have a lot of expertise in that area, and both of you in your work beyond your writing work know about the workplace as well. And I am really interested in how, just as you were saying, Molly, like the boundaries, not just between feelings in general and the workplace, have started to break down, but the boundaries between big feelings specifically, and some of those most difficult feelings, like despair, like regret, like anger, is really are really breaking down. And the question that I had, and tell me if you need a little more context on this, but the way that I was thinking about it was like, what is the life of big feelings at work? Like, when you, based on everything that you know about the workplace and what you know about big feelings, like kind of where do big feelings live? How are they treated? What kind, are they lonely? Are they ostracized? What's the state of their inclusion and belonging at work? Kind of however you interpret that, but what do you think is the life of big feelings at work? Liz, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, I think the real life of big feelings at work is that they exist. It's usually not that you're going through a period of despair at home and then at work everything's fine. Or if you have a really frustrating day at work, you don't normally go home and have like the most amazing dinner with your partner ever. It all sort of spills into each other. But I mean, and we talk about this in our first book, No Hard Feelings. There's definitely still this idea, even as emotions have become more acceptable in the workplace, of I think it's very much focused on fix it fast, and fix it without disturbing your colleagues. And that's, we write about this too. I think in 2020, this big word was resilience, and it was the answer to everything. It's like, oh, there's a global pandemic, be resilient. You're struggling as an employee or a single parent at home, be resilient. And I think that misses the fact that it's actually really important for the work environment, for the people around you, to create a space in which it's easier for you to be resilient. And so with big feelings, I think it just comes down to acknowledging things like that. So as a leader, saying like, this is a global pandemic, it's really hard, and I'm feeling it too. If you want to reach out to me, I'm here for you. If you need support, here are some other options that we've made available to you as an organization. Because it's when we keep trying to ignore them or pretend that they don't exist at work or at home, that's when I think the big feeling actually becomes destructive, both to the individual and to the team, because it's just this constant surface acting as if nothing's going on, and then it festers and what gets worse and worse. So even something like anger, if you see your report is frustrated, having a conversation with them in a one-on-one and saying, hey, I noticed, you seem to have a strong reaction in the meeting yesterday. I want to help you. Can we talk through a bit of what happened and what needs you have and how I might help you address those? And that's, I think, a really productive conversation versus pretending like it didn't happen. And then that person is just like festering and festering for months. So similar to our first book, I think it requires a little more intention and care to talk about bigger feelings, but it's really important to acknowledge them.
Yeah, it's also an interesting provocation in what you're saying. If we're expecting leaders and teammates to have those to engage in those conversations with each other, I think for a lot of organizations that's a whole new skill set that needs to be developed, right, and invested in. Which is interesting. Molly, what do you think about this?
I also think it's a new skill set, and it's creating the time and space to do that. So when we think about dealing with big feelings in our personal lives, we try to, like at our best, make the time and space to talk with it. We have time with our therapist, or we're feeling frustrated with our family members. We don't react right away. We say, I'm going to calm down, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to find time and space to discuss that with them. There's something that I do with my husband where we have like a check-in every Sunday. It sounds really corny, but it's like we check in on the relationship and what are we doing well, what could be better in the relationship. And it's a held space, because it can be really awkward to bring up like, hey, what you do really annoys me in the middle of the week. And so like, how do we create space for that? So I think we sort of recognize that in our personal lives, not to say that we always do, great with that either, but in work, it's like, how would we even begin to create the space to talk about these things? We're in back-to-back meetings all day. We're remote, so we can't really grab people like in the kitchen as much to talk to them, or we're hybrid. And we have no training, as you said, on like how to bring these things up, but there's a huge need for them. And I see this with, the organizations that I've worked with and currently work with, where there's a relief to be able to talk about them, to be able to share, I was angry about that, or, the decision that you made, I have a lot of regret, or that we made, I have a regret around that, or I'm feeling a lot of uncertainty about our return to work and our hybrid work. And they're so bottled up that it's like, it's like we say, okay, we're going to do a leadership retreat and we're going to go talk about some of these things, or we're going to bring in someone to do mediation, or we're going to bring in a coach. And those things are very helpful, but what we're missing is the like built-in time on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis of talking about these things, or having a space to bring up, I just felt anger with you, or that anger has turned into resentment because it's been a long time. And for whatever reason, most workplaces haven't built in the time to do that, even though, it shouldn't take that much time.
Yeah. And if you like, so these are some really great, and the time piece, I think, is a really important note, because I think that's something that so many organizations are conditioned to. Time is precious, but conditioned to always prioritize spending your time on things that are more traditionally or quantitatively productive. And big feelings never seems like one of those things that warrants prioritizing or making time for. But there's no way to really deal with big feelings without taking the time to do it. And I'm curious if you, in an ideal scenario, if you had a magic wand and could describe like what a kind of workplace of the future where big feelings, I don't know if big feelings big feelings living their best life is quite the right way to put it, but where the organization maybe is living its best life in how it navigates big feelings. What is that workplace? What is the life of big feelings at that workplace?
Yeah, I'll start.
Yeah, go ahead, Molly. Yeah.
So first of all, I think helping people have better self-awareness of their own styles in terms of expressing and dealing with emotions. So we have several assessments on our website, and we have them in both of our books too, for people to understand their own emotional expression style. Are you an over emoter? Are you an under emoter? Are you somewhere in between? Just having that language to say, okay, like, I'm an under emoter. And so what that means is you're going to have a harder time reading my big feelings. They're not going to come out as easy. Whereas an over emoter might be able to say, okay, you all know me, I'm an over emoter. Like, I'm going to get on the positive side, I'm going to get really excited about things. On the more, have to deal with side, you're going to sense when I'm getting really angry about something. And then also understanding like conflict styles. So we have a conflict assessment. Are you a conflict avoider? Do you like to get into conflict with folks? What's your anger expression style? So all of these things can help us, like, number one, have a greater understanding of our own tendencies, but also have shared language to share with the other people we work with who, see this all the time in the workplace, where there's a bunch of people who are conflict avoidant and really, really get uncomfortable when there's conflict. And then there are people who have been raised to just like hash it out. And when those people come together in a project team, that's not great, because one person is going to shut down and the other person is going to feel like, well, this person isn't engaging with me and I'm offended by that. So starting there, I think workplaces have done a great job of having like work style, like DISC assessments and the big five, and bringing those in. And those are helpful, but they don't deal necessarily with emotions. They touch on them, but they don't quite get there fully. Then I think it's about training. So there's a lot of great research that has been done about how to talk about big feelings. So at Stanford, they teach a class called what's affectionately called the touchy-feely class in their business school. And one of the things that they share is a phrase called, when you blank, I feel blank. And it's a really nice phrase to say, like, when you do this observable thing, you're not making a judgment, but when you interrupt me or when you make an assumption about how I'm feeling, I feel blank. And that puts it in very neutral words. And there's two books we recommend, one called Crucial Conversations and one called Difficult Conversations, that give people really specific phrasing to use when dealing with big feelings and having to talk with other people about them. So training around that. And then I think, again, the last thing that I just mentioned was space. So what does that look like for your team? Well, thinking about the cadence of the work that you do. So maybe for some people, they're on project-based work, and so they can schedule, a check-in in the middle and the end of a project to talk through any anger or frustration that's coming up. And then if you're not on project-based work, scheduling these things, on a monthly or quarterly basis, the most important thing is to put them on the calendar. Our lives are ruled by our calendars, and if they don't go on the calendar, they don't happen. And it can feel sort of awkward, like, oh, we're putting time, to discuss our feelings on the calendar. But the thing is we don't do that. Like this is the point of our first book. We still have feelings, like they don't go anywhere. They just are not dealt with productively. So I've a lot to say, but Liz, go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead, Liz.
Just to underscore the importance of everything Molly said, to me, if I waved the magic wand, a sign of success would be, it's a workplace where if I'm a manager or a leader, my reports are actually coming to me in one-on-ones or in meetings and saying like, hey, I just wanted to flag something for you. And then really well, or like eloquently articulating what's going on. And so you've trained them to talk about it, to know how to talk about it effectively. You've given them shared language. So I'm an under emoter, you know me, that I don't deal well with uncertainty, things like that. I think that to me would be a sign of a really healthy workplace, is where individual contributors actually feel empowered and safe talking about those kinds of things, especially with more senior leaders in the company, because they know how to do so and they know that it will be treated with empathy and respect, and the leader will help them figure out what to do next.
Can I just add one more thing
to
it? And Mike, I want to hear your answer to this question too, because I feel like you have a good answer. When our first book came out, we interviewed Kim Malone Scott, who wrote the book Radical Candor. She used to be a manager at Google. And one of the things she said, she talks a lot about feedback, which is great. But in terms of dealing with emotions, one of the things that she said was one of her reports came up to her one day and he said, I know what kind of day I'm going to have by the look on your face when you walk in the room in the morning. She was like, oh, I'm really not hiding these emotions as much as I thought that I was. And people can pick up, especially on leaders' emotions. Like it's funny, we think like, oh, I'm hiding this from my team because I don't want to bother them with them. Well, they can probably tell if you're angry or frustrated. And so Kim said, what she started doing was flagging her emotions. So she had a bad morning, like her kids were, driving her crazy, or she had a bad commute or whatever. She would come in and she would say, hey, I'm having a difficult morning. I just want to flag that. It has nothing to do with you, but I don't want to make your day worse. And I just flag that. Or if it does have something to do with the team or the organization, flagging that as well. This happens all the time when we move from meeting to meeting and we have something difficult come up in a past meeting, and then we're still processing those emotions. We go into the next meeting. You can flag and you can say, hey, and use the check-in that we demonstrated that Mike had us do in the beginning, like what's on your mind, what's present for you. Hey, I was just in a meeting where there was a lot of frustration, so I'm sort of still processing that. I think we're so afraid of emotions, because of big feelings, because we haven't always seen them dealt with well. We've seen people cry, and not that that's a bad thing, but cry and yell in the workplace. And we don't want to do that, but we need to get better about talking about our emotions in a less emotional way, and naming and flagging feelings is one of the best things that you can do. I'm feeling this. There's sort of a relief. People are like, oh, thank you for saying that. Like, we could tell that you were feeling that, but thank you for naming it. But yeah, Mike, what about you? What would your workplace look like?
No, this is all such great advice. My mind always starts going to, what are the practices and some of the things that we've done or people have done. I think one of the things that you're both pointing out is like creating some kind of more, if you want to shift the culture around this, then what you see in the new and improved workplace is somewhere where it's much more common, much more normal to name big feelings. And I like one thing that reminded me of is in some, we do regular reviews at August, and we're always kind of iterating on the questions that we ask our teammates to share. And one question that I've asked before that I always like the feedback on is, what's something I've been doing that's frustrated you, or that has been frustrating for you? Just to put that out there. It's an optional question; they don't have to answer it, but by asking it, I'm making the space for somebody to share something that maybe they've been holding on to. And I was also reminded, crucial conversations in those books are so good. And another language similar to what you were describing, Molly, that has stuck for us at August is basically the protocol of the specific phrase is the story that I'm making up. But in the overall phrase, it's like, I saw you do this, or I noticed you do this, you did this. The story that I'm making up is blah, blah, and you name your own interpretation of what you thought the person was doing or what you thought their intention was. And then you name your feelings. And the way that made me feel was, whatever it is. And just that phrase, being able to kind of separate and name, this is the story that was running in my head, and it may be completely different from what your intention was. I'm not implying what your intention was, but the story that I made up.
I love that. I love that. My therapist actually recently said that to me because I get really anxious about the future, especially when it seems unpredictable. And so she, very similar phrase, was just the story that I'm telling myself about the future is, which is flagging it as like, it's not reality, it's not guaranteed to happen. And it allows you to have some emotional space from this horrible future that you've created in your brain.
Yeah.
I think that's also about coming to the space with a sense of curiosity too, which is like, okay, I have my interpretation and I'm going to share that with you, but I'm also curious like what your interpretation is. And Liz and I, what you said of like, what's something I'm doing that's frustrating you or annoying you. Liz and I work together. And so we have had our own big feelings in our work. And I think when writing our first book, we had to figure out like, what do we do when we're frustrated with the other person or angry about something they did? And we've tried to, I think we sort of have to hold ourselves to a higher standard with this because we are writing a book about emotions, but we try to bring these things up as soon as possible. So even little things like, I remember when we first started writing together, Liz and I have very different styles of using Google Drive. And I was like getting so frustrated that she would like open a new document in her own drive, not in our shared drive, and like wouldn't put things into folders. And I was like, just the story I was telling myself was like, this person is like so disorganized and like they're trying to make my life harder. And obviously that was not what Liz was trying to do. And she is very organized, but so I let it go for too long. And now we bring those things up like right away. Like the other day, I texted Liz something work related. And she was like, hey, can you in the future, can you email me about this? Because I'm going to lose the text message. And it's like these little things that really matter in a workplace that can turn into anger and then resentment when we don't check in.
Yeah, one other question that my colleague Alexis introduced to us that I really love is what's something that I do that isn't really a big deal right now, but if we work together for 10 years, would drive you crazy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I also thought of, I'm imagining your list of the 7 big feelings, which are uncertainty, comparison, anger, burnout, perfectionism, despair, regret, and imagining that there's a monthly protocol. Like if you're on your working team as part of your monthly retrospective or whatever, you might list those 7 and be like, which big feelings did you have about our work this month? It's open it up, invite people to share.
I love that.
Yeah. One was sort of similar. One, I remember a leader was telling us about a check-in that she runs at the beginning of each meeting, where she'll go around and quickly ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most present, how present are you right now? And if someone says anything below a 3, she'll say, is there one small thing you can do to improve how present you are? And often it is. It's just like, I'm getting all these pings on Slack, or there's this one email that I know I need to respond to, and I just can't stop thinking about it. And she'll say, take 5 minutes, answer the email. I'd rather have you come back and be very focused on the meeting for 25 minutes than have you here for 30 minutes completely distracted because you're getting all these notifications. So I think, again, to the point of making space, bringing stuff out in the open, and also just acknowledging that, yeah, it's normal. It's normal to have a barrage of things and then you can't focus. So I think I love the idea of making this a monthly, a quarterly thing. But again, to Mollie's earlier point, there's also really nice ways of making it a daily practice that then will make it easier to open up during those bigger monthly post or pre-mortems.
Liz, I want you to stick with you on this and just keep going on about focusing on leaders. So within an organization, what are some of those things, like the one that you just mentioned, and any other things that you can think of, kind of specific behaviors or practices that leaders in particular can use to improve how big feelings are showing up in the work?
Yeah, so one Mollie mentioned earlier with the Kim Scott example, which is flagging your feelings without becoming emotionally leaky. So it's totally fine to have a bad day, just saying like, I had a rough morning, has nothing to do with you. I just need a moment. I saw a friend actually do this in a meeting, which I thought was just such a lovely way of flagging that something had happened without turning it into, she just needed a moment to process. And so someone said something that was like fairly offensive to her, and she just held up her hand and said, "I'm having a really strong reaction to what you just said, and I need a moment." And it was just like the whole room was like, oh. And so it was like this lovely way, again, of flagging that was not okay. I'm not going to immediately assume the worst. I'm not going to lean into my reaction. I'm going to formulate a response, and we probably should talk about this later. So small moments like that. And then in our first book, we also talk a lot about this concept called selective vulnerability. So as a leader, it's really valuable to open up and to share your feelings, but you also have to think a little harder about what you're saying, because people look to you for information. And a big part of your job is also to create stability for the team. So selective vulnerability, we always say, is pairing a moment of honesty and openness that builds trust with a path forward, which also kind of builds trust within the team. So saying, with the global pandemic, this is really challenging. I'm feeling it too. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. Here are resources. Here's what I'm planning to do over the next 3 months to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we're supporting each other, and here's what I need from you. And so that's very different than coming in and starting to sob on a meeting and be like, this is so hard. I don't know how we're ever going to make it through, which will undermine your abilities as a leader, because people might feel close. They might feel a human connection to you, but they will no longer trust that you are going to keep their jobs intact or lead them through the challenging times. So it's opening up, thinking, what you want to share with people, but then also providing space for them and providing security for them in some way.
Yeah. And what about you, Molly?
Yeah, I think leaders do have to think longer and harder about what emotions to share. And that's part of the hard part about being a leader. There's no way around that. And like Liz said, I think being selectively vulnerable, it's going to look different for each person and each situation. There's no sort of right answer in terms of what to share and what not to share. I think, what leaders have to do is provide that path forward for what's going to happen next. And I think one of the best things that you can do as a person in the workplace is identify other people who you think are really good at this. So we often ask, think, in our workshops, think of a past leader who you think did a great job of being emotionally open, but also maintaining some sort of confidence and trust in themselves, so they weren't sharing too much information or saying I have no idea what to do next. And there's so much that we can learn by watching those people and modeling our own leadership style after them.
Wonderful. Well, we are running long on time. My last question for both of you is, what's something that you wish I had asked you? If you want to let me know what that question is, and then maybe briefly give me your answer to it.
Yeah, I can start, and then I'll start and hand it off to Molly. I think I loved the phrases that you mentioned. So the story I'm making up is, I wrote everything down. I'm going to remember those. So I think just a phrase that we have in our book that I found really personally powerful and helpful is, when you're facing uncertainty, when you're going through something difficult, we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves to have everything figured out day one, to be perfect, to know all the answers. And instead to say, I am a person learning to blank. So if you've just gotten promoted, I'm a person learning to be in a senior leadership position, it makes you much more open to asking for feedback, to seeking information, to learning and growing, to improving over time, as opposed to showing up on day one and being kind of a stiff robot because you're so afraid of making a mistake and you just feel like, I'm here, I must be perfect, the split second that I get this job. And I think it's also helpful when you're going through hard times, just to say, I'm a person learning to cope with, losing a loved one. I'm a person learning to exist through grief. I think it's a nice way to give ourselves more grace, which I think is very needed.
I love that. That quote also stuck out to me. I am a person who is learning to blank. So useful. And Molly, what about you?
we've talked in other settings about the generational difference at work, and I think there's so much there's too much that's put on that, in that, like, I think the research shows that many different generations, like, when they enter the workplace, everyone feels, oh, this is a disaster, and then they grow up, and so it's much more about being young in the workplace, I think, than generational differences. That being said, I do think that Gen Z has grown up in a time when emotions are shared more widely in their personal lives and at school. And so when they enter the workplace, they bring that expectation with them. Liz and I are both millennials. And it's really interesting to see what's happening with that, where I think even millennials are like, whoa, like, I'm supportive of emotions at work, but like, this is real. Like, I would never say that at work, or I would never share that at work. And Gen Z, it's like, of course I'm going to share. This is part of who I am. I'm a human. So I'll be very curious to see what happens with this as that generation moves further into the workplace. I think for the most part, it's good. It feels, I think, in some cases like a lot to older generations, because they don't really know what to do with these emotions. And so to go back to our earlier comment, I think the answer isn't like, oh, Gen Z, they're bringing like way too much of their personal lives to work, like, let's shut that down. The answer is, well, how do we take that and build it in so that we can deal with it in a way that's productive in the workplace, and that's a lot of the things that we've talked about. So I'm just very curious to see what happens in the next few decades.
Me too. I think that's such a great kind of provocation, and also I think that's how it is showing up in workplaces. It is a provocation that organizations are now dealing with, and I believe and I hope that it's moving us in a better direction. Well, I could talk about this all day, but we don't have all day. So thank you both so much, Mollie West Duffy, Liz Fosslien, authors of Big Feelings. Thanks for sharing your time and your wisdom with me today.
Thank you for having us.